Ladies and gentlemen, a very, very wonderful good evening to you. Tonight we're discussing probably one of the most important exhibitions that Ben Uri has ever presented in the last 20 years that I've been involved. It's called Sheer Verve. It's about the Women's International Art Club, which was founded in 1898 in Paris. And for all my years in the art world, I'd never heard of it. When Sarah McDougall first raised it and said that she had met a exceptional individual who had done her PhD on the Women's International Art Club. And my response, Sarah will remember well, was, what is that? And I suspect that many people have said, what is that? But then either having read Dr. Richmond's thesis, dissertation, or heard her talk will know a great deal more about it. So tonight we're very fortunate in having Sarah McDougall and Dr. Una Richmond with us to tell us about this event, this club, which I think was far more than a club. But I think, if I may, just so introduce you. So Una, you're there, and Sarah McDougall, who you know well, has been our curator for into decades near enough now, plural, and it's a great privilege to have you both. Una, can I kick off with you, please? First of all, thank you so much indeed for all the support and all the help and all the direction and guidance that you've given to Sarah and to the Ben Uri on this exhibition. It's really been a privilege to work with you, and thank you. Tell us about the Women's International Art Club. I mean, where was it founded? Why was it founded?
Yeah, do you want me to share some slides?
Sure. Why not?
Yeah. I'll just start. Hold on a second. Okay. Now, can you see those slides?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So the Women's International was founded, as you said earlier, in Paris in 1898 by a painter called Maud Hurst. And her student friends sort of realized that they didn't really have exhibiting opportunities. I mean, lots of women artists went to train in Paris, as you can see in this picture, but there was a distinct lack of opportunity for them to show their work. With the exception of an artist called Gwen John, who's actually in the Sheer Verve exhibition. She was quite celebrated in Paris, but mostly women were ignored. So they decided to set up their own club, and they called it the Paris Club, but that actually changed in 1901. They changed it to the Women's International Art Club. And so one of the reasons for setting it up is that selection committees for art societies, art clubs, were very male dominated. So in the case of the New English Art Club, for example, as you can see in this image, the selection committee for the New English Art Club was entirely men. And that was the case for much of the 20th century, actually. So they formed their own club, they formed their own committees, and they had their first exhibition in 1900, but in London. They started in London at the Grafton Galleries in 1900.
I can't help thinking that there's some synergy between the New England Art Club, the London group, Ben Uri, all people who essentially were marginalized by the establishment, deciding to actually take matters into their own hands and creating exhibition opportunities for themselves. Would that be fair?
Absolutely, definitely, yes. When I saw why the Ben Uri was set up, I thought there's an incredible synergy there, yes. Because Jewish artists, immigrants, they were all marginalized as well, yes.
And who was involved? I mean, you know, were they just amateur artists or serious professional artists or?
No, they were serious professional artists. And that was one of the criteria, actually, that they had to have a formal training or had exhibited elsewhere. So professional only. There was over 2,600 artists who exhibited over its history.
Wow.
Yeah, a lot. Here are just a few of the well-known names, but and they were mainly British. But 40% of exhibitors were of international origin. So again, this is a list. This is not including some of the well-known artists that are included in the sheer Verve exhibition that Sarah's going to talk about later. And then on the right-hand column, you can see some historical names of women artists. Now, the Women's International periodically held exhibitions with historic artists, so they borrowed from galleries and collectors some of the artists from abroad and British artists to exhibit with the club. That's some of the well-known, but then there's some key members that are less well-known. So, for example, Dame Ethel Walker, very celebrated in her day, but maybe not so well known. Equally, Mary Fedden, Catherine Guthrie, or Avida, who is in the sheer Verve exhibition, and Mary Adshead, all leading lights in the Women's International. But there were also non-artist committee members. Again, women who were involved or gallerists, basically. So they were involved as well.
I see many names in the two slides you've given that's Sarah's and her team of research for the Benary Research Unit.
Yes, indeed. Because yes, your collection is made up, is it 29% women?
29, yeah.
Yeah, which is far higher than most collections in Britain and elsewhere, actually. So as far as what they exhibited, they showed mainly painting and sculpture. Before 1938, there was an arts and crafts section, but then after 1938, they stopped that. And I think that was to do with legitimizing their professionalism and trying to compete with clubs like the New English Art Club and the London Group. So it was mainly sculpture and painting. And as you can see, these are actual images from two of the exhibitions.
Where were their exhibitions?
Oh, no, they were in. I'll just show you. They started in the Grafton Galleries, which is a sort of major central London gallery. They were there for a while, but then afterwards they went to various other London galleries. The New Burlington, the image on the right-hand side, they exhibited there, and that, interestingly enough, was the venue for the International Surrealist Exhibition in 1936. Which included Eileen Agar, one of the first, the only British women in that exhibition. And she's the one fourth from the right. And she, as we know, there's a work by her in the sheer Verve exhibition as well. But then later they exhibited at the Whitechapel Gallery, and very successful there. But and in those bigger galleries, they were exhibiting 300-400 pieces of art.
Wow.
Then as membership dwindled, they then started exhibiting in smaller galleries. And on the left-hand side, there's a gallery called the Drean Galleries. That was owned by a Women's International member, Halima Nelesh. So yeah, they didn't just show in London though. The Arts Council sponsored touring shows. So they would the Arts Council would choose about 25 works from the annual exhibition, and they would go on tour in England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And they also had exchange exhibitions with women's art groups abroad. So the catalogue front on the right-hand side is an exchange exhibition with the Greek Women's Association, and that was in 1965.
Amazing, amazing. And in these touring exhibitions, you say that there was obviously a much smaller body of work. What other countries did they tour to?
Oh, to Italy, to Florence, and to Paris. And that was the only, that's the only time they went abroad. But then they invited women from abroad. So the Austrian Women's Art Association, French women artists, Canadian, American, Australian. I think that's about all. Yes, yeah.
And I'm diverting for a second, if I may, but where would you put Britain in the pecking order in terms of recognition of women artists during this period? Were we ahead of the curve, or?
Yeah, I think probably better than Europe. Certainly, yes, I think probably better. It's hard to say actually, because I haven't really studied their women's art associations. But a few years ago there was a conference, and yeah, it seemed very clear that these women's art associations don't have the same records that the Women's International has. So probably better than most, I'd say, here.
Fascinating. And the Grafton Gallery, in terms of hosting the exhibitions for a long time, or because it did, am I correct in saying that the first exhibition in the UK was 1900, 1901 at the Grafton
1900.
Galleries? 1900 at the Grafton Galleries?
Yes, at the Grafton Galleries.
And how long did they support?
Oh, that was for about 20 years, but then they moved on to the Suffolk Street Galleries, and then they sort of hopped about the Burlington and the Whitechapel, and yeah, they didn't have a base, you see, they didn't have a premises, so they just had to exhibit where they could. But that, like the London Group and the New English, they did the same. They just went into whichever gallery was available.
They were ahead of their time.
I think so, yes, actually.
And how positive? It must have been a very positive experience for the artists if there were 2,600 artists involved over the century.
Yeah, definitely. It was a way for them to exhibit and sell their work, to make a living, further their careers. But it also was a way to become involved in a kind of management capacity, in a committee, and sort of have autonomy and have a say in what they were showing. Because even in as late as 1974, selection committees were still dominated by men. And only around a quarter of the membership of the New English Art Club and the London Group were women, and very few women were on their committees. So yeah, it was very, very helpful way of women to get seen. And some of them were seen and then went on to have solo shows because they'd exhibited at the Women's International.
And I know you can't be exact, but were these shows sought after as buying opportunities by collectors, or was it more an academic exercise?
A little bit of both. I think to measure, I've got some stats here, to measure them in terms of success, I think sales, mixed, very mixed bag, as you can see. Attendance, again, the audience numbers were lowish. But when they exhibited at the Whitechapel Gallery, there were thousands came. So I think the Whitechapel's reputation sort of says it a lot. But there's very few records of attendance, of sales, of response really to the Women's International Art Club, apart from reviews. So it is hard to tell, and this is the only record really that I could find that they kept of the sort of thing, that the TV and the radio and all the reviews that they were getting. So it's really hard, and then the records at the beginning of the century are practically non-existent.
Is there a particular archive that's protected?
Yes, there's an archive at Goldsmiths University, and at the V&A as well. So yes, well, I've got lots of information, but just not before 1912. And yeah, things like sales figures and attendance figures.
And Una, do you know how many of the nationals, I mean, I'm thinking Tate particularly, would have bought from these shows to
Would have
develop?
bought from the shows. You see, that's what I'm not sure of. Um, there's a few would have. The government art collection have certainly bought from the Women's International Art Club. I know that. But I'm not too sure about other collections. Again, more research is needed really, because I was looking at the Women's International as a whole rather than individuals. So yeah, more work needed, I think.
Craig Taylor, who's one of our guests, is just commenting that there are a lot of newspaper reviews before 1912, which I'm sure you are well aware of.
Yes. In fact, I have a little snapshot,
just by chance,
a little snapshot of the sort of things that were being said. Very mixed,
women can't paint.
Women, exactly, from the outrageous to the slightly condescending of feminine frolics and why the art dealers don't like women. There was one half of the commentary which is really quite misogynist and sexist, and those tended to be in, I think, the Daily Herald was the women can't paint one. And then you come over to the right hand side, and Eric Newton, no second sex in art, that was the Guardian. Women's Royal Academy, I can't remember what paper that came from, and then the Women's Art Club exhibition, well up to standard. And the Telegraph, the Times, they were all very complimentary. And the art publication Art News and Review did some very, very good reviews of them. So well received generally, I think, in the press.
If there's time, and I know that these our lectures always go on for a little bit more than we're supposed to, but if you can, you must tell us a little bit more about what the article said about why art dealers don't like women.
Because women, apparently, women go off and have babies, and then they don't concentrate on their art, apparently.
Oh, apparently,
yes, which is absolutely not true, because most of the Women's International Art Club members and exhibitors had children, and are carried on, and it didn't affect their work.
They managed to have careers as well and be
great. They did, funnily enough.
The superior sex. Una, what a terrific background. Thank you so much indeed.
That's okay.
Is this background that really captured Sarah McDougall's imagination some years ago, and the result is here in Boundary Road. And I can tell you that I'm always proud of our exhibitions, but I'm particularly proud of this one because it really is. It's a powerful survey of extraordinary number of little vignettes. And Sarah, please take us through it.
Okay, thank you. And thanks David and to Una for fascinating as ever, stimulating introduction. I'm always learning more and more from Una. There's so much to know, and that's really why it captured my imagination. So let me get my slideshow going. Okay, so there we go. So really, what I'll do now is take you on something of a whistle-stop tour through some of the works we have on show in the exhibition. And I thought I would just explain that The exhibition itself is inspired by Una's research, and what I've tried to do really is to bring together a selection of women artists who are both the very well-known names that perhaps we all know, the Barbara Hepworths, Elizabeth Frinks, Gwen Johns, Paula Rego, and so on. You know, women who were really first in their field and had really strong independent careers. And then they've been juxtaposed with a lot of lesser known women who are also, as you can see from this opening slide by Anna Meyerson, really strong painters in their own right. And I was able, in this regard, to bring out 20 of the women from the Ben-Uri collection who had all shown in various capacities at the Women's International Art Club. And I was very struck by this particular review, which Una shared with me from the 1960s, in which it was said that a selection, particularly of abstract works, demonstrated this sheer verve. And I felt that was a really good starting point for the exhibition, for its title. And I absolutely wanted every work in the exhibition to have that quality of sheer verve, to really pack a punch. Something else that Una uncovered, which we laughed about, was some of the early descriptions of women sculptors. It was said that, you know, women wouldn't be able to achieve sculpture because they, you know, they were too weak, basically, and they couldn't physically carry out such work. And of course, one of the most common epithets, generally by male critics, of women's art, particularly of things like still lives and depictions of motherhood, were that these works were charming. So you won't be finding any charming works in the selection tonight, but I hope that they all will have sheer verve. So what I also wanted to do was to bring together women from very diverse backgrounds. Another thing that we were able to discover through Una's research was that women of Jewish, immigrant, refugee backgrounds, of queer backgrounds, these were all finding a welcoming space at the Women's International Art Club. They had this opportunity to exhibit, and they had opportunities for networking. So I will be flicking through the slides. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background there. And I've been warned that because of time, I really can only say a very tiny bit about each slide. But I do really hope that you will all come in and see the real things for themselves, which are so much more exciting too. So I start with Anna Meyerson because she opens the exhibition for us. I think this has the qualities of sheer verve we're looking for. Of course, it's an abstract work. Anna Meyerson was one of many from the so-called Hitler emigre generation, so Jewish artists who were escaping persecution in Nazi Germany and in Austria, who found refuge here. And many of them went on to careers where they were very successful in their own right, but many of them sadly are lesser known today. And that lesser known quality is something that will be revisited by myself and my colleague Rachel Dixon in a little kind of sub-series of talks called Unsung. So moving from Anna Meyerson, I wanted to put these two women together. This is Lena Pilico on the left. Her name was Lena Pilachowski, but she exhibited under the name Lena Pilico. And on the right, one of our better known exhibitors, who is Sonia Delaunay. And of course, she needs no introduction anywhere. And she was one of the many international women exhibitors who correspond to that international part of the Women's International Art Club name. And what I've done under each slide is just to show the years that these women exhibited with the club. So that description applies to the artist and not necessarily to the artwork. Sometimes the artwork was actually shown in a Women's International Art Club show too. The point of putting these two women together is that they both had artist husbands, and yet they both had successful careers of their own. Lena Pilico on the left, we're seeing here a design that she did in the 20s or 30s. It's actually a design for a scarf. And she was a woman who was married to Leopold Pilachowski, who was actually Ben-Hur's first president, and he did very traditional work on Jewish subject matter, but you can see how different is her work here. And that was described by a critic of the time as hot, exuberant fantasies. Lovely description. And she was actually the first woman artist that Ben-Hur gave a solo show to in 1927. The fact that she was married to the president, I'm sure, had nothing to do with it, because you can see what talent she demonstrates by herself. And of course, Sonia Delaunay was someone who had a very successful artistic partnership with her own husband, Robert Delaunay, but she also, of course, had her own successful career too. And she was the only living woman artist to have, I should say the first living woman artist to have a retrospective at the Louvre in her lifetime in 1964. And the work that we see here is a version of an oil that she actually showed at the Women's International Art Club. So again, very strong women, works by women working with abstract themes. Lily Delissa Joseph here, very different work. This is first of a series of 3 works which introduce a sub-theme of portraiture. So works throughout the exhibition are arranged to show little sub-themes or vignettes. Each wall tells a different story. And so we have 3 women in the next 3 slides who are showing portraiture, which between them ranges over almost 60 years. So the greater part of the club's history. And Lily Delissa Joseph is someone who's really exceptional, because we see her here painting herself as a woman observing the Jewish Sabbath. We see here she's modestly dressed, she's covered her head, she has the lighted candles, but she's also staring out very directly and engaging us as viewers. And what she is also concealing is many other aspects of her artistic identity. So she was also a very radical woman. She was a suffragette. She was detained in Holloway jail and missed her own private view because of it. Her husband very proudly proclaimed that in an advert, so he was a great supporter. She was also one of the first women in England to drive a car. She drove a car all the way to the Middle East in the 1920s. It was an electric car, which didn't perform very well, and so she gave it up. And she was also one of the first women to fly a plane. And she was also a patron of other artists, helping the young Isaac Rosenberg to go to the Slade School of Fine Art. So she is someone who is able to negotiate all these different identities, and was a very successful exhibitor in her own lifetime. Clara Klinghoffer, who we see here, was also of a Jewish heritage, and she came to England as a young child at the age of 3. She was something of a child star as a painter. That's a very difficult label later on in life often. And she had her first solo exhibition at the age of 19 while she was still a student. And this work that you see here was the first work which was purchased by a woman for the Ben-Hur collection in 1935. And it shows another artist. Her name is Pratima Devi. She was an Indian artist, and she was also the daughter-in-law of Rabindranath Tagore. And her sister, Sunayani Devi, was also an artist, and she was one of 6 Indian women artists who actually showed with the Women's International Art Club. From her, we move to Ottilie Talansky. She's also from the so-called Hitler emigre generation. She exhibited very prolifically in her lifetime, and she made a particular feature of studies of women and self-portraits. And we see here a slightly impressionistic technique and a particular attention to the detail of the pose and the clothes that the woman is wearing, which are really evocative of the late 1950s. I've moved this in the PowerPoint. It's slightly differently arranged in the exhibition, but I wanted to juxtapose them with the wonderful Stella Stein, who is one of the lesser known artists who really deserves to be much better known. She painted in this very flat style, using these bold colours, and we all absolutely loved this portrait. She was someone who trained in Dublin, where she was born, and then in Paris. In Paris, she knew James Joyce and was the earliest illustrator of Finnegan's Wake. She also taught his daughter Lucia to paint. And then she went off and spent a year at the Bauhaus. And she's actually seated her model here upon a Bauhaus chair. So from Stella, we move to a work by Vanessa Bell, so a very well-known exhibitor. I really love this painting because it's here to stand for a number of things. Obviously, it's a still life within an interior, but being a key member of the Bloomsbury group of writers and artists and intellectuals, as she was, and sister to the famous writer Virginia Woolf, who of course coined the phrase "a room of one's own" in her famous book. And so this interior makes us think about those interior spaces for women. Making those rooms of their own was very important to women artists in this period. And probably the room that's depicted here is Vanessa Bell's studio at Charleston, the home that she decorated with her life partner, Duncan Grant. And so it makes us think about what is revealed in the picture and also what is hidden. So from Bell, we move to this beautiful Prunella Clough, and this is part of a section of 3 works, which again look at abstraction, 3 very different abstract painters who were all sort of pioneers in their fields. So Prunella Clough here with her bypass, may be looking down on an actual bypass. It's suggestive of sort of the radial forms you might see looking down on a map, or it has been suggested it's also perhaps the kind of forms you would see in cellular biology. Of course, it may be all of these things or none, but it is a beautiful abstract painting. And we've juxtaposed it within the exhibition with this fantastic work by Helen Frankenthaler, so another of the international contingent of exhibitors. Interestingly, with Helen Frankenthaler, when she was asked to contribute to the Women's International Art Club, she refused to do so on the grounds that she never joined clubs or societies on principle. But she didn't know, apparently, at that time that her work had already been shown at the Women's International Art Club when it was shown as part of a contingent of works by American artists. And this work, to me, is really suggestive of an exterior scene. The 3 works together are suggestive of exterior worlds and come after that interior world that we've looked at with the Vanessa Bell. And Frankenthaler, pioneering American abstractionist, pouring her paint from above like Jackson Pollock, and also pioneering this soak stain technique. In this period, she's moving into acrylics, and that gave her a really sharper focus with the paint that she was using. Beneath that is this fantastic work by Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham, and this one was actually shown at a Women's International Art Club exhibition. And here we really have a consideration of exterior forms with her 3 rock forms, which show this kind of precise drawing style that she brought to her painting as well. And she had been inspired by a series of glaciers in Switzerland. And again, we have this very complementary palette with the 2 works that go before it. And she is one of 5 artists in the exhibition who also have a significant part of their careers in Cornwall. She would divide her time between Cornwall and St Andrews ultimately. Then we move from her to a little section about surrealism, and this is an early work by Paula Rego. The surreal aspect of her work is perhaps less well known, and this is a really exciting, vigorous work, much sheer verve in evidence here, and this is from 1965. So Paula Rego, of course, was Portuguese born, and she was training at Slade in England in the decade before, in exile, of course, from Salazar's fascist regime. But she's actually referencing here Franco's dictatorship in Barcelona. In this year, he apparently issued an edict to poison all the stray dogs in the streets of Barcelona. And she was absolutely outraged by this and the thought that of this inhumanity to animals, and also, children, other people could have picked up this poison as well. So you can just see the forms of the dogs in the picture. There's a suggestion that the figure on the right may be that of St. Francis of Assisi, and you see a bird form at the top there as well. But it's a narrative which, although difficult to read, does set the scene for that later work that she does, which is all about oppression, righting wrongs, and of course doing so much for women through her art, and actually managing to change the abortion laws in her native Portugal because of the strong stance she took in her work. David, we can see you yawning there.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh, I beg your pardon.
Juxtaposed with that is this powerful head by Elizabeth Frink, and she's looking here at the inhumanity of warfare. She used her husband as the model here, but we see the effects of war in this cauliflower ear and split lip and broken nose. So again, looking at strong international political themes. Then two further surrealist works, a head here again, and this is a head by Eileen Agar of Caliban. And I've just put up there that little verse from Ariel's song in The Tempest, because I think she's really referencing these idea of something rich and strange that we find there, the pearls, the corals in this beautiful sort of slightly abstracted and very surreal technique, mixing oil and collage. I think her Caliban is rich and strange, but certainly not monstrous. And then that is juxtaposed by this work by Ethel Colquhoun, who was a long-time member of the Women's International Art Club and strongly surreal in style, but she managed to be kicked out of the Surrealists because of her opposing interest in the occult, which was also very strong. And this work mixes elements of Dada and the occult and surrealism, and is perhaps an ambiguous form mixing male and female attributes. From that, we move to this absolutely fantastic sculpture by Marlowe Moss that I think we're all in love with. You see it here from the front, where it looks very like a spatial form that you see here in the title. The bottom part is constructed, the upper part is suggestive of the planets, perhaps the movement of the planets there. When you see the piece from the form, you can see that the larger piece is actually an ovoid form, an egg form as well. So it's highly suggestive, and that fits in really well with the surreal work that goes before it, but also has this strong constructivist element. And she was someone who also worked significantly in St. Ives, but she was excluded from the circle of Barbara Hepworth and Nicholson, who of course are so strongly associated with St. Ives. And Hepworth, of course, famously had her studio there. We can still see it today. Her studio overlooked the harbour at St. Ives, and her work here shows the pull of the tides and her interest in natural forms. So we see the moon there, and in the gallery, it's juxtaposed with the moss. So you see these two holes that she famously creates with the strings, using again very modern materials. And, you know, the date of this piece, 1969, of course, we're thinking about the space age there. And the moss, although it's in the decade before, really seems to anticipate that. So we move from that to the last work in the upper gallery, and that's this fantastic piece by Orovida Pizarro. It's absolutely huge. You can see I've left the dimensions there on the slide, and it's created in this egg tempera that she mixed to her own recipe. and she was inspired very much by non-European art, particularly Indian, Chinese and Persian art. And then she made these imaginative compositions. And around this work in the gallery, you can see also is a very decorative silk brocade border, all of which were elements that she chose and put together. And she was a really key Women's International Art Club exhibitor on the hanging committee. She showed this piece there twice. In fact, she showed more dates than are actually showed on the slide there. And she was also on the hanging committee for a time. Laura Knight almost needs no introduction, and she was one of the most influential figures in early 20th century British art. She achieved many firsts. She was the first woman artist to be made a dame in, I think, 1929. The first woman since the founding of the Royal Academy to be made a full Royal Academician in 1936, and the only woman artist to be sent at her own urging to cover the Nuremberg war trials, which was the subject of an earlier exhibition at Ben-Uri. Here is one of her works referencing the circus, which was a huge interest and an ongoing part of her work for many years. We have here from the lower galleries 2 further Hitler emigres. Both works tell something of the women's own histories as well. The work on the left by Adela Reifenberg is a portrait of her sister-in-law, who was actually a pioneering court reporter in Germany, a vocal anti-Nazi opponent, and she had to leave Germany in 1933 with her architect husband the moment that the Nazis came to power. She made her way through Palestine, ending up in Britain in 1938, and Adele Reifenberg and her artist husband, Julius Rosenberg, also came to Britain, ending up here in 1939, where they were all reunited. But perhaps she couldn't have known that when they all set out together. And this work, when it came into us, has a slight fold down the centre, where it clearly was rolled up and perhaps travelled in her luggage when she came to Britain as a memento of her sister-in-law. The work on the right by Elsa Meidner is so deeply expressionist in feeling. It takes us back to her German heritage. She was one of the artists who also had an artist husband, Ludwig Meidner, who is the much better known of the pair. And he would eventually return to Germany, where he would eventually regain his reputation, while Elsa Meidner would stay here in England. And despite 2 solo shows at the Ben-Uri Gallery, I would say, unfortunately, mostly her career dwindled into obscurity, and she had a very difficult time here. We have then a very playful nude by Dora Gordine, who was one of the best known British sculptors at the time, and she has really been rediscovered by the late Dr. Jonathan Black, who did brilliant work on Dora Gordine, and his colleague, Professor Fran Lloyd, who has also lectured widely on Gordine. And what I love about this piece is this open, playful, celebratory female nude by a woman, which really confronts that notion of the male gaze, very much the female gaze here. And this makes a really good contrast with this piece by Polish emigre Janina Baranowska. From a distance, you can see very much that compositionally this is a male nude. But when you get your eye in, as it were, you can see that actually she's exploring the story here from Ovid's Metamorphosis. She is showing Actaeon being torn apart by his hounds after spying on the chaste goddess Diana. This really powerful vigor in her work is really very much part of her own style. But interestingly, she was also trained early on over here under the artist David Bromberg. Other works in that room have a family theme and also tell other stories of migration. We have Amy Drucker's For He Had Great Possessions on the left, looking at a migrant family, possibly victims of the economic slump in the 1930s. It's juxtaposed with this work by Helena Korn. We both have these people in an exterior looking or we can see in the background these lighted interiors and these sort of scenes or barrows of fruit in the East End in both cases. Helena Korn was a self-taught artist. She was another Hitler emigre, a refugee, and she later suffered from depression after learning that all her family had been killed in the Holocaust. And she really found therapy in her work, but she really celebrated the everyday. And she said we should find as much beauty in, people at the bus stop in Kilburn High Street as in, an Italian landscape. And I think she's definitely right there. So we do have two works on maternal themes. And the work on the left is particularly interesting in that it was done by Bettina Ehrlich, another woman who had an artist husband, Georg Ehrlich, the sculptor, whose work she assisted and whose reputation she assisted. And she really put his career above her own. She had been a very successful painter in her own right in Vienna, and her work changed style over here in England. And the work that we're showing there is a newborn baby, and it's actually Erica, who was the daughter of the art historian Otto Kurz. He was interned as a so-called enemy alien on the Isle of Man, and Bettina made 6 pastels of the newborn baby so that he could see what his new daughter looked like. And it's juxtaposed with work by another Hitler emigre, Nonnenmacher. And here we have 2 works by Gwen John, who Una mentioned earlier on, and that's juxtaposed with a little work by Marie Laurencin. So both of these women were working in Paris at the same time. They both often worked on a small scale. They both took women as really the subjects of their art, but their styles were very different thereafter. So Laurencin loved to celebrate the female nude. Her works were often erotic, often playful. Gwen John, of course, also did a number of nudes, but here we're looking at a work from a sequence she did of women in the interior of Meudon Church. She would observe them from behind, from a pew, so they would often not know they were being observed. And here we can see details of their clothes, their hats, that give us that period detail. They were both championed by the collector, American collector John Quinn, and they were both shown in the Armory show in 1913 in New York. And he hoped actually to put them together in a show in New York, but in the end that didn't come to pass. So I'm trying to come along here to the end and to speed up a little for you. There's a little sequence of works on still lives. And I was very keen that these should be modern still lives again, not the charming ones we mentioned earlier. And here we see Lotte Reisenstein, another Hitler emigre, and the very bold dynamic style that she uses here. Thin paints and often using the end of the brush and so forth. It works really well with this beautiful little work by E.Q. Nicholson, who was connected to that whole painting dynasty again of Nicholson's. Her artist husband was the architect Kit Nicholson, and he was one of the sons of William Nicholson, and she too assisted him in his career. But she also was a very successful designer. You can see the design elements in this composition of jugs and quinces, and she's perhaps best known for her runner beam design, which was one of the designs used, of course, in the Royal Yacht Britannia. And it's juxtaposed with this work by Greta Marx, who's best known for her work as a Bauhaus graduate. Her ceramics company, which was incredibly successful but was Aryanized by the Nazis, she came over here to Britain, and she was unable to recapture that success here, although she did continue to work in ceramics. What I love about this piece is it combines her interest in ceramics and in flat work. So it's a piece that hangs on the wall but is made of tiles. There's suggestions of still life in it, but it also goes into abstraction there too. Fantastic little work here by Sandra Blow. This is absolutely tiny, but again, really important pioneering abstractionist in this country, having embraced art informel and worked really with all sorts of different materials and really showing sheer verve in her work, also spending a significant part of her time in Cornwall. Then I finish here with this work by Zena Flax. And Zena is one of 9, I believe, living artists who are surviving members of the Women's International Art Club, though she's the only one that we have on show. This is a work from the collection. It's called Forest, and it's a lithograph, but I think it's, again, absolutely packed with the sheer verve of the title. So tonight I've just been able to really run through some of the elements of the exhibition. I really hope that you will all come and visit it for yourselves. The works are so much more exciting in real life. And we'll also have lots more talks in this series. Next week, we have a fantastic talk by Una and Mingting Yu, and they're going to really go in depth into the history of the Women's International Art Club. And then many other speakers will speak in more detail about many of the things I've touched on: abstraction, surrealism, Bloomsbury, and many other elements. So thank you for listening, and over to you, David, for closing.
As this title of this exhibition, or this lecture this evening, is the curatorial introduction. Sarah, can I ask you and Una, as you've both been so deeply involved, how do you start to actually identify the stories that you want to tell in an organization that's been around essentially for 80 years and had 2,500 members? Explain to us, if you will, the curatorial methodology, which I think everybody will find interesting. If you can come off the screen, then we can go back to.
Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Let me just close that.
Because we're also used to going to exhibitions. We see exhibitions, we enjoy them, we comment that this is great, this is not so great, whatever it is. But unless you're actually our curator, or as fortunate as I am to work closely with wonderful curators, most people have got no idea how these things actually are constructed. So please, we've got 10 more minutes. Let's just help us.
So, well, I'll start and then hand over to Una. But I think one always knows you can never tell a full story. And of course, we could never hope to show, these 2,500 women exhibitors over 80 years. So the exhibition could only ever be conceived as a snapshot of that. People who know our space know too that at Ben Nuri, we have a very small space and we have to be really creative with that. And so that is why we tell the story, these many stories, in sort of little subsections and vignettes. And I thought it was important to have some of these really well-known exhibitors to show that they too showed with the club, but also to bring out these many unsung women, these many lesser-known artists who often did have long, successful careers, but somehow fade from history, and their success is often not on a par with the male exhibitors, simply because in the early part of the century, at least, their visibility was not so great. And of course, that was where the club came in. So I suppose from my point of view, with Una's fantastic help, we were able to identify the women who had shown at the club from the Ben Nuri collection. And that was really the starting point. And then to say, well, what can't we tell with the works we have by those women, and what can we tell? And then that's where we start to look around for other women and what stories they could contribute. But I'm talking too much. I must hand over to Una.
No, I think we also decided that there was such variety in the club. I think one of the critics said exhilarating variety was one comment, as well as sheer verve. There was lots of comments like that. So we wanted to show that variety, so still life and abstraction and portraiture, everything that was sort of dominant in the Women's International Art Club, and all the different styles as well, especially abstraction and expressionism and surrealism, all the isms. So yeah, I think that's how it came together, really.
And I think we had also many women who achieved firsts, and sometimes those firsts were, like Sonia Delaunay being the first living woman artist to show at the Louvre, or someone like Greta Marx, who is very well known as a Bauhaus exhibitor. Not Bauhaus exhibitor, having the Bauhaus history and then being a ceramicist. And someone like Laura Knight, who was such a sort of influential figure, but again, just to put them against these other lesser known women. And many of those women, of course, are the women who found their home at Ben-Uri and in the Ben-Uri collection, but sometimes they achieved first there, so being the first woman whose work we acquired, or the first woman who had a solo show, and so on.
I think what's telling about the show is the point that you are a great protagonist of this, of making sure that Ben-Uri shows are a productive mix of those who have established themselves and enjoyed fame and fortune, and those whose fame and fortune were transient, and in some cases didn't exist at all, but unfairly so. And I think, although the ground floor is, I'm sorry, I'm talking in an abstract form because everybody hasn't been yet. The ground floor is where the real blockbuster exhibits are, but downstairs is where you've integrated those artists of who should have been more recognized or should be more remembered than they are down there, are really fascinating. And I think that's one of the things I would say to our guests and to their friends is that when you come, and you must come because it really is an exceptional show, don't spend all your time looking at the greats, the Marlo Moss, the Barbara Hepworth, the Elizabeth Franks, the Colquhouns, the Cloughs. These are all marvelous, but go downstairs. There's such a selection of works there by artists who many people have never heard of, but yet they've got real strength to them, and that's what makes this show, I think, one of the most exciting of the year. So, my friends, ladies and gentlemen, I can only commend the exhibition to you. We have a remarkable digital program. There's going to be an event every week for 13 weeks. There will be a gallery guide in the gallery for you to go around with lots of more information. There will be an online catalogue with very, very erudite essays by very distinguished scholars. This is our major show of the year. It's near enough 3 years in the making, and it's an investment that has been well worth it. So I commend the show to you. Sarah, as ever, my thanks. Una, what a pleasure it's been to work with you, and will be too. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I wish everybody a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Good night, everyone.
Bye.